Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is the third Iranian Studies Initiative and co-working event for the spring semester. Unfortunately, we're still on the Zoom format. Hopefully, there'll be occasion where we can be in person again, hopefully by the end of this year. But today's session is titled Global 1979 Geographies and Places of the Iranian Revolution. This, for those of you who didn't come to the panel a couple weeks ago, this is the second of a three-panel series that we're hosting this semester. And it's connected to a larger project that we actually began in 2019. When I say we, I mean Ali Mirsapasi and myself and the Iranian Studies Initiative. And those were actually some of the last in-person events that we had here at NYU. These were specifically what we did in 2019 was that in order to mark the 40th anniversary of the 1979 revolution, we brought together about a dozen researchers drawn from very different disciplines or multitudes of disciplines: history, American studies, political science, and so on and so forth. And we brought them together, and rather than imposing a framework for them to study the Iranian Revolution, we presented them with basically a question, a provocation. We asked them, in what sense, if at all, was the Iranian Revolution global? How were the inspirations for the revolution connected to places beyond Iran's borders, as well as part of how was the revolution part of the production of different spaces and places within Iran? We asked what conceptions of the world existed in 1979 that brought Iran in close proximity with societies and political struggles elsewhere, and a whole series of other sorts of questions that we posed to the audience, to these panelists. What came out of these questions and the response to these questions were two workshops that we held, one at NYU in May of 2019, and a second one at Columbia University in December of 2019. And the fruits of those workshops, those discussions, and the hard work and research of these dozen researchers is a forthcoming book that will be published by Cambridge University Press in the summer 2021 with the title Global 1979. What we're doing in these panels, the one that we had a couple weeks ago, today's panel, as well as one more that will take place in April, is to bring 6 of the authors of these chapters to present some of this research, their findings. They're grappling with the question of what is global history, what is transnational solidarity, and so on and so forth, and having them share this with you and this public audience. Now, as a collection, the edited volume that is about to come out this summer, we don't subscribe to a view where the global implies planetary coverage or a world-spanning web or a boundless set of movements of flows and ideas that generates homogeneity. Instead, I would say, as a collection, the essays and the authors that are contributed to this volume, we emphasize 3 interrelated facets or dimensions. First, like the Iranians in the 1960s and 1970s, we envision a world that is not smooth and is not undifferentiated. In fact, movements are channeled and designed to hop and skip over some places and land in specific locations and nodes. As such, the globe is a series of point-to-point connections that can be mapped out and should be put into discrete historical contexts. And you'll get a flavor of that in a moment. Second, we're committed to viewing the global and the local as interconnected and even interdependent. Thus, geographic scales, including the local, the urban, the national, the regional, the global, and so forth, are interpenetrating and historical products rather than bounded and timeless abstractions. And third, the global is our method of de-exceptionalizing Iran and the Iranian Revolution. So rather than treating the Iranian Revolution as some sort of nativist or insular or particularistic events, we want to push these kind of exceptionalist readings. Having said that, though, I want to stress that the authors, including those that are with us today, examine Iranian history as a totality. And they do so quite carefully, in which the Pahlavi regime, as well as the opposition, come into the same frame, as do the religious and the secular, as do the left and the Islamists, as do the men and the women, as do the urban and the rural, as do the Arab world and Iran, and so on and so forth. So we emphasize understanding Iran, the revolution as a totality, and understanding the different ways that these social groups and spheres are interlaced and mutually dependent and even mutually constitutive. So our panel today brings together we'll give you a sense of some of the ways that we tackle, we develop these ideas, and many others as well. And hopefully you'll have an occasion and an interest to pick up this volume when it does come out in the summer. Feel free and pick it up as a downloaded digital version, purchase the hard copy, or if you like, you can go ahead and try to steal it from a store, as what we were told back in the day to do. So I encourage you to not only pick up the book to read the book chapters that are the basis of the two talks that we're about to hear about, but as well as the other chapters in the volume. So the first speaker will be Gulnar Nikpour, who's going to present her chapter, which is titled "The Criminal is the Patient, the Prison Will be the Cure, Building the Carceral Imagination in Pahlavi Iran." Dr. Gulnar Nikpour is assistant professor of history at Dartmouth College and holds a PhD from Columbia University's Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. From 2015 to 2017, Gulnar was the A.W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in 2017-18, she served as the Neuber Junior Research Fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Her research has been supported by the SSRC, as well as the Mellon Foundation and the Giles Whiting Foundation. She is currently finishing her first book, titled, or tentatively titled, "The Incarcerated Modern Prisons and Public Life in Iran, a study of prisons and punishment in 19th to 20th century Iran that situates the expansion of Iran's modern prison system in the context of the global expansion of incarceration." Gulnar serves on the editorial collective of the journal Radical History Review and on the editorial boards of the Jadliya Iran page and Radical Histories of the Middle East series at One World Press. She's also a co-founder and co-editor of Bi Taruf, a journal for Iranian arts and writing. Our next speaker is also somewhat local and New York based, is Manijeh Moradian, and she will be presenting her essay titled Iranian Diasporic Possibilities, Tracing Transnational Feminist Genealogies from the Revolutionary Margins. Manijeh is Assistant Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Barnard College at Columbia University. She received her PhD here at NYU in American Studies and holds an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from Hunter College at CUNY, City University of New York. She is the former co-director of the Association of Iranian American Writers, and her first book, which is titled "This Flame Within: The Iranian Revolutionaries in the United States," is forthcoming from Duke University Press. Her essays and articles have appeared in the Routledge Handbook for the Global 60s, Scholar and Feminist Online, Women's Studies Quarterly, Comparative Studies of South Asian, African, and Middle East, and the Middle East, Social Text Online, Jadliya.com, and Kalalu. She is a founding member of the Raha Iranian Feminist Collective. And we're lucky to have a discussant for our two presenters today. And it's our very own Bita Musavi, who's a third-year PhD student in history and in the joint program in history and Middle Eastern studies. And she is currently studying the history and material politics of the Iranian state formation, land reform, and religious revival. Before joining NYU, she earned her BA at the University of California, Berkeley, which is somewhat relevant when you hear from Manisha on her study of the Iranian students in the Bay Area. So I'm going to stop here. We'll turn the floor to Gulnar, and then after that, it'll be handed over to Manisha. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I want to take a moment first to thank the Kevorkian Center for having me here today. Thank Sahar Soleimani for all of the work she's put in organizing and promoting this event. And particularly want to take a moment to thank Arang Keshavarzian and Ali Mirsapasi, our intrepid hosts and leaders in this edited volume. The opportunity to work with this amazing set of scholars, Manisha included, has been really a dream come true. It's been a real pleasure. And I just want to take a moment to publicly thank them, not only for this event, but for all of the work they've done in the last 2 years in bringing us together and giving us such a rich set of provocations to think about, and in creating a really rare, I think all too rare space in the academy to have the kinds of generous, intellectually rich, generative conversations that I think we crave, but sometimes can't find. So I'm just very, very grateful for their work and for their presence. And I want to take this moment to thank them in front of everybody. So today, as Arang mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my chapter for our edited volume, which, again, as Arang mentioned, is called "The Criminal is the Patient, the Prison Will be the Cure, Building the Carceral Imagination in Pahlavi Iran." So Arang told us a little bit about the edited volume, which I assume both Manisha and I will return to a couple of times. The volume, as mentioned, we were given a provocation. We weren't told that we had to agree on our sort of what global methods might look like, or that we wanted to use them at all. But we were given a provocation to think about the 79 revolution in Iran, and to really think about whether or not global or transnational methods were necessary, were good, were going to help us get at questions we maybe couldn't have gotten at in other ways, and to meditate on how that on questions of globality might sort of change the lens of how we've done modern Iranian historiography to date. So when I was first thinking about what I might write about, my instinct was to think that I would write something about political prisoners in the time right around the revolution, both Islamist and leftist, and the global movements to which these prisoners linked themselves, in some cases quite directly. And my broader research, as Arang mentioned, is on the history of prisons and prisoners in modern Iran. So I was trying to think of a way that that I could bring together my interests with this question on the global 79. The more I thought about it, though, the more it seemed important to me to tell a different kind of story. I think in transnational, in transnational studies, oftentimes because of our own ethics, politics, interests, we gravitate towards these movement connections that might interest us. But I was trying to think about a different kind of story. After all, the emergence of the modern prison everywhere, not only in Iran, is, I think, a constitutively global story over the course of the last century or two. It's in the vast majority of human history, we don't have prisons the way that we have them now. And all of a sudden, in the last century or two, everywhere around the world has found this kind of consensus on how to punish, right? It's caging people behind locked doors. In other words, I don't think we can understand the modern prison very well without something of a transnational approach to help us make sense of why this institution emerges as it does in these seemingly different contexts, right? And these are not, and I think Arang gestures to this too, these are not just global processes in a kind of abstract or in an abstraction, right? They're not just happening in a vacuum. They're born of a profoundly unequal and indeed colonial world order. So one of the things that I talk about in the chapter is that the very moment in the early Pahlavi years in the 1920s, when Reza Shah, he comes to power, and one of the sort of foundational transformations that he makes is centralizing the legal system in Iran. And this has started in eras before, but it's taken on in a really aggressive way in this moment. But that comes with building and centralizing a modern prison system. Scholars have talked a lot about how important law and legality was to early Pahlavi folks, but they didn't really talk that much about the prison as such. I want to just really quickly share my screen. Hopefully it'll work. And I have a few slides I want to show you, and hopefully we can go from there. Okay, so let's see. Can everyone see this? Okay, so as I was saying just a moment ago, how do we understand prisons? Are they global in Iran? How do we understand their emergence? What were their global models? Why were they adopted? And how do we go from having virtually no prisoners in the late 19th and early 20th century to having 250,000 today? And what does this have to do with questions of law and legality that are being bandied about? Now, this raises a kind of second question for the context of the edited volume, it seems to me. If I moved away from that original political prisoner idea, then I have to probably explain a little bit what this earlier history, why am I talking about early Pahlavi history now in a seminar, in a volume on the 79 revolution. So what do prisons have to do with 1979? And how do we understand that kind of link, right? So I'm thinking about the constitutive globality of the prisons, but how am I thinking about prisons and the revolution? Now, in the chapter, I start with just the very days of the fall of the Shah, when revolutionaries are demanding, and have been demanding for months and months and years, in fact, and in fact, winning freedom at this moment for hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners. And even in the sort of final days of the revolution's success, revolutionaries are storming prisons to release political prisoners still held behind bars. And I share with you this image that I found in some revolutionary ephemera of the time of an image, a cartoon of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi sort of taking off the face of his veneer, the veneer of humanity and the sort of military garb to reveal nothing but a kind of terrifying skeletal prison behind, right? So for those of us who know something about the revolution, we know that this is a fairly standard trope, right? The revolutionaries across the political spectrum are talking about the Shah and prisons as one of the major reasons why they're interested in transforming the state. This is true of political figures across the political spectrum. It's so true that another scholar by the name of Dariush Rejali, who's written on torture in Iran, has called the 1979 revolution the revolution against torture. Yet despite this enduring image of revolutionaries freeing political prisoners and the revolution against torture and this image you see before you, my chapter is actually not so much about political prisoners as such. Instead, what I try to do in the chapter is I try to push us to look a little bit beyond the more well-known story of the political prisoners around the time of the revolution, and process perhaps start to trouble the rigid distinction, the categories that we have in our taxonomies of types of prisoners to begin with. What do I mean by this? So what I mean is, on the one hand, we tend to talk about political prisoners in the Iranian context, prisoners of conscience, and then kind of an undifferentiated mass of other detainees and prisoners, right? Now, I should note here that this distinction between political prisoners and non-political prisoners, or political prisoners and ordinary prisoners, is itself born of the distinctions made first by the Pahlavi state and later by the Islamic Republic, where prisoners are housed in two distinct, if uneven, categories. Ordinary prisoners on the one hand, Zendaniya Addi, and security prisoners on the other hand, Zendaniya Amniyati, who are Iran's prisoners of conscience or political prisons. Now, the vast majority of Iran's prisoners have always been the former category, ordinary prisoners, both in the Pahlavi era and in the Islamic Republic era. Now, despite the logic that would divide these prisoners into these two hermetically sealed categories, which kind of tacitly imagines that the security prisoners, the political prisoners, are unfairly persecuted, and the ordinary prisoners are real criminals who belong behind bars. Many of the ostensibly non-political charges for which people in Iran in the lead up to the revolution and before are incarcerated in Iran and as elsewhere in the world are for self-evidently political issues. In other words, the historical and indeed global processes through which all modern states, including Iran, have naturalized the notion that social issues from drug use to sex work to border crossing to theft to whatever demand carceral solutions. That is itself a political process, and it's a global process, right? So that's the kind of foundational argument I'm trying to make in the chapter. That's the bigger picture. So in a sense, I am beginning the chapter, and I sort of begin with a provocation. We're starting with these revolutionaries storing gas prison to free some prisoners, but not others. They're calling into question some punishment techniques, torture, and not others. So I begin with a provocation. I say, what are the historical processes, and indeed, what are the global processes that have made Iranians across the political spectrum? I mean, we can't agree on almost anything, right? We're disagreeing about everything. We're having like revolutions every 50 years, but we all come to agree in a really short period of time between the 1920s, 30s, and by the time 79 rolls around, that there has to be prisons, that we have to have modern prisons, and that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have to be behind bars, even though there's really no precedent for that in Iranian history whatsoever. And again, I really want to emphasize this, that in the 1920s, from what I've discovered in my research, and even as late as the beginning of the Pahlavi era, like 1925, 26, there was only about 300-400 prisoners in Tehran, which is where most incarcerated people were held at that time. So in the whole of the country, we're still talking about just a few hundred prisoners. And up to the 20th century, there really wasn't anything like long incarceration. The archive shows that even being held for a year would have been unfathomable well into the late 19th and dawn of the 20th century. So how that's in my grandmother's lifetime, right? How in that lifetime do we now have a context in which virtually across the board there is consensus that prisons are just part of the cost of doing business as a modern citizen, right? Okay, so I want to just give a couple of examples from the chapter, and then hopefully have some room for questions. I'm not so good at looking at the chat questions as I go, so someone can stop me if there's some budding question I have to answer in real time. Okay, so I start the chapter with, or I start the sort of next part of the chapter with what was 20th century Iran's most important prison, Qasr prison. And this is an image of it not long after it was built in the 1930s, which I found in an archive in Tehran. Now, Qasr itself had global roots. It was built by a Tbilisi-born architect named Nikolai Markov, but perhaps even more importantly than that, it's the idea for the prison and sort of expanding Iran's prison system in some part comes out of Iranian law enforcement and statesmen going to these global conferences on prisons and policing. So in 1925, officers in the Iranian police force attend the International Police and Penitentiary Conference in London. Now, at that conference, the president of the International Prison Commission, a very British-sounding person by the name of Sir Evelyn Ruggles-Breese, welcomed participants from all over the world to discuss what he was calling the humane and rational punishments promoted by the commission. He argued, and the commission's whole raison d'etre at this point is to argue that these methods will decrease crime all over the world, that the way to decrease crime is to actually build certain kinds of carceral sites. They're arguing that prisons will solve social problems. With modern policing in prisons, the IPC is essentially arguing, the world would see a radical decrease in criminality and a reduction in the abuse of detainees. They're saying, okay, they would be tortured before and they would go out and do more crimes. This way, we're going to rehabilitate them and they'll go out and be model citizens. The Iranian delegation goes home believing that they need to overhaul Iran's prison punishment system along some of the lines promoted at the conference. And it's right after this that they decide to build Qasr. It was not the only new prison that was built. There's tens of new prisons that are proposed, and several which are built. I go into those numbers in the chapter, and I can go into them in the Q&A if you're interested. Pahlavi statesmen are arguing at this point that Qasr is going to hold people without class distinctions, that they're going to be disciplined, that they're going to be treated the same. And images show that they're just in the immediate moment before this era, actually, in the 1910s and 20s, they're starting to wear certain kinds of uniforms. They're starting to look like modern prisoners, right? So it's really in this era that gets sort of imagined all over Iran as well. Qasr is the main space, but this is something that's being sort of promoted in prisons across the board. Now, there's another really important outward-looking reason for these prisons, and that is that Reza Shah believed that this would prove to the global powers that Iran was ruling by the rule of law, and that they were a sort of civilized and proper modern state. This was particularly important for those of us who are interested in Pahlavi history after the 1928 abrogation of capitulations to the foreign powers, which put foreign nationals, if they committed a crime, they would have been subject to Iranian law. So Reza Shah wanted to show, okay, and you have diplomats, American and European diplomats coming in and saying, hey, yeah, this prison looks pretty decent. It looks modern. Almost right away, Iranian citizens, reformists, writers are talking about the failures of this prison to do the things that it's supposed to do. Particularly anxiety provoking is what seems like an explosion in female criminality, what seems like an explosion in child criminality, all these anxieties about Qasr in particular, about Tehran in particular, not being a seat of justice and legality, but rather Iran's sort of capital of sin and vice. So I talk a great deal about that in the chapter, about all of these sort of texts that are coming up and saying, wait a second, these prisoners are doing drugs. They seem to be involved in illicit sex acts. This is not the rehabilitative space we were promised. Now, in this moment, and this is a really big sort of part of the chapter, I start talking about the emergence of the academic discipline of criminology in Iran. This is happening very much in conversation with European criminology. And in fact, after the revolution, several really key criminologists from the Pahlavi era say, maybe we were looking too much at Europe and not paying enough attention to what was happening in Iran in terms of rates of crime and so forth. So I look at several unpublished PhD dissertations and also academic monographs that are being written in direct conversation with Euro-American criminological trends. And they're particularly interested in the work of French sociologist Gabriel Tard and Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria, because they're trying to think about how can we actually turn the prison into this space of rehabilitation that we believe that it can be. Again, following Euro-American trends, these criminologists start to argue for the need to have better prison labor and education systems. So there are several new prison factories built. The most robust one at first is in Qasr. Like everything else, it happens at Qasr first. This is an image from the 1940s from Qasr prison factory. These dudes are making shoes. Like everything else, also at Qasr, it's deeply gendered. So female prisoners are learning like how to cook, and the male prisoners are learning how to make shoes, I guess. But these criminologists are arguing that we need to have labor, that labor can transform people, body and soul, into good citizens. Bad criminals can be turned into good citizens. So all of a sudden you have all these criminologists, people like Taj Zaman Danesh, who also taught at Tehran's police academy, talking about crime as a kind of social disease. And again, this is happening in conversation with trends in Euro-American criminology, and prison as the cure, or at least a quarantine. Taj Zaman Danesh is really interesting because she is both a criminologist and she teaches at the police academy. Her work is used in cadet training and lawyer training. So you start to see the connections between these academic discourses and the state. I sort of then move on to telling the story of a state institute that picks up these criminological discourses, the Institute for the Cooperation and Industry of Prisoners, Bongah Ta'awun Sana'i Zendaniyan, which is founded in 1954 and is mandated with building these prison factories and education facilities. Now, interestingly, the organization borrows not only from criminological discourses, but also languages born of Marxist social theory. And in this, I take some influence by the really important work of Afshin Matin Askari, who has made a really compelling argument that the Pahlavi state, especially around the time of the White Revolution, is actually borrowing quite heavily from the Marxists it's also trying to suppress for a kind of intellectual legitimacy. So you have this weird thing like the chief of police of Iran, Mohsen Mobassar, in the 1960s, saying that the new prisons in Iran are using the dialectical method. They're using dialectics to better transform prisoners to cure their social ill into productive citizenship. Mobassar is a really interesting character, and I will talk about him in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So at this point, and I'll just say one last thing before concluding. At this point, the institute for that I just mentioned for the industry of prisoners, the production and industry of prisoners, it starts being really involved in building a bunch of new prisons in the 60s and 70s that are expanding this rehabilitative logic even further. The names of Iranian prisons are being changed at this point to reflect this rehabilitative impulse, to reflect the idea that they think prison labor in particular will cure the social ill of crime. The central prison in Tehran, for instance, Zindan Markazi, its name is changed to penitentiary, place of penitence, Nedamatgah, again in conversation with global trends, right? That's the penitentiary model of imprisonment. While other prisons stop using the word Zindan altogether and start using the word Andarzgah, or place of counsel. So the transnational implications of these reform efforts go far beyond academic discourses or just these names of places or whatever. Some of these new prisons that are being built, for instance, 2 prisons, one built in Mashhad and one built in Shiraz, are based, in fact, on blueprints from what is now the smallest supermax prison in the US system, the USP Marion in Marion, Illinois, which was built just a few years before its Iranian counterparts. Marion is now famous for its novel experiments in solitary confinement and group therapy in which prisoners are made to express penitence. And its model is sent all over the world: Iran, Israel, New Zealand, the United Kingdom. And all these prisons are being built in the 1960s. So it's not that Marion exists for years and years and years, and then the model gets sent out. These are experiments that are kind of happening coterminously with new models of incarceration. So one of the sort of major arguments I try to make in the chapter is that this shows, and these 2 prisons are still functional in the Islamic Republic. They're still part of the current Islamic Republic system, just as Marion is part of the US Supermax system. So I'm trying to make the case that even in places that are imagined to be politically diametrically opposed, like the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the carceral level are in fact operating in some cases from literally the same blueprints, right? So I end the chapter by making what is the last global intervention in the chapter, which is to argue that, rather than being cured, we see that, in fact, the carceral system has produced sort of exploding numbers of prisoners all over the world, what critical prison scholars in the US context call mass incarceration, mass criminalization. And a scholar by the name of Lisa Cacho makes the point that criminalization is not merely the process by which people get marked as potentially criminal, but the process by which certain actions in the modern era have been newly categorized as crimes, thus rendering populations who have historically undertaken those actions vulnerable. So in the US context, you might think of the racialized vulnerability of Black men. In the Iranian context, you might think of border crossing, the Afghan-Iranian border, as producing a certain kind of vulnerability, or gendered dress, or any number of things, right? In other words, all over the world, it's not that prisons reduced crime, but that carcerality, the project of modern carcerality, has produced criminals in need of carceral correction, that this is not an essential and sort of static category. It's something that is expanded by virtue of the expansion of the carceral state. So that is the sort of concluding argument that I make in the chapter. I've already talked too much. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great, thank you very much, Gulnar. And just to remind everyone, please put your questions in the chat section, and we'll get to them in the Q&A part of the event. but I'm going to turn the floor over to Manisha for her presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all who've tuned in. And I want to just start by echoing what Golnar said about how grateful I am to Sahar for doing all this organizing work, and really the exemplary kind of intellectual mentoring and support that Ali and Arang have shown to us, and bringing together an intergenerational group of scholars to do kind of groundbreaking work together has been just a wonderful pleasure, and really pushed me and made my work richer as a result. So I'm really so thrilled to have been part of this multi-year long process. It's been an honor. I am going to, well, first of all, thank you, Golnar. I always love listening to your work and the global abolitionist possibilities that emerge from it. I'm going to start in a slightly different register, but hopefully converge somewhere so we can have a productive conversation. So my chapter for this volume was called Iranian Diasporic Possibilities, Tracing Transnational Feminist Genealogies from the Revolutionary Margins. It's a mouthful, it's true. But so, you know, my background's in American studies, and I, in some ways, might have been an unlikely person to include in this, but I do work on the Iranian revolutionary movement from the vantage point of the diaspora. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by this, but I wanted to begin with one of the most exciting moments I had while carrying out my archival research for my book, which is on Iranian student activism in the United States before 1979. And this moment occurred in the Hoover Archives at Stanford in 2015, when I came across a pamphlet titled Zanan Daneshju Mutashakkel Mishavand, or University Women Are Getting Organized. I had not been looking for this pamphlet, despite the fact that the gender politics of the Iranian student diasporic left is one of the major lines of inquiry in my book, but I had not been looking for it because I didn't know it existed. None of the over 30 veterans of the student movement in the US had mentioned it. I interviewed people who were part of the Iranian Students Association, which was the US affiliate of the Confederation of Iranian Students. And this was active in the United States as a kind of coalition of students who were studying abroad and who opposed the Shah of Iran from the very early 60s all the way through the revolution itself, and gradually became more and more leftist in its overall outlook. So nobody had mentioned it. And yet there before me was this roughly 15-page document, perhaps the only publication of the Northern California chapter of the Iranian Students Association, or ISA, perhaps the only publication of the Women's Committee of this Northern California Bay Area chapter, which detailed really the efforts of Iranian women and men to develop an analysis of how patriarchy structured the workings of feudalism, capitalism, the Shah's dictatorship, and Western imperialism. Even more interesting to me as a transnational feminist scholar was the fact that the pamphlet directly addressed what they called male chauvinism, using the lingo of the time, the lingo that was circulating from other movements like Students for a Democratic Society, who they were very much in contact with. The pamphlet directly addresses male chauvinism within the ISA and the student movement more broadly. Not only did the pamphlet outline a capacious understanding of women's oppression that transcended the economic determinism of the versions of Marxism that were popular across the Iranian left at the time, but it also demanded that the struggle against sexism be immediately placed at the center of the student movement and not deferred until after the revolution. This pamphlet was, for me, incredibly valuable documentation of how debates over the role of women in anti-imperialist and decolonial movements were playing out. across different third world liberation movements, right? Including within the ISA, which, as I said, was in close contact with other diasporic leftists from other locations who were also foreign students in the US, and also with American leftists from different racial backgrounds. So the language of the pamphlet, it really strains, it tries to conform to a kind of standard Marxist script of the woman question, but it continually kind of veers beyond those formulations into what I argue we can now readily identify as socialist feminist frameworks. The pamphlet contradicts itself. It lurches back and forth between economic reductionism and a broader view of patriarchal social relations, and ultimately argues that the larger goals of national freedom must unfold through women's liberation rather than be placed above it. The work of the women's committees of the ISA and the analysis in the pamphlet show that the ability to organize openly, in other words, above ground, right, outside Iran, to put up flyers and hold a meeting, to hold joint meetings with other activists from different backgrounds, to have demonstrations with other anti-imperialist organizations and movements, and to have personal and political connections with a wide range of leftists from different nationalities and racial backgrounds, really created unique conditions under which a handful of Iranian leftists, who wrote this pamphlet, right, could begin to articulate a project of women's liberation as part of, rather than secondary to or a distraction from, the larger project of third world revolution. So the space of diaspora, for me, becomes this unique vantage point for understanding how third world feminism emerged as a global phenomenon from within anti-racist and anti-colonial movements. And really working on the diasporic wing of the anti-Shah opposition has allowed me to situate those debates within the Iranian student left within a set of relationships and conversations that were playing out globally and in the US, which we could think of as a kind of imperial metropole, right, which had drawn people from all over the world to it. So one of my arguments is that we need to stop telling the story of global third world solidarity as a narrative of the circulation of ideas by and between men, and pay attention to the ways that these struggles globally also gave rise to new forms of gender consciousness and feminist politics, which began to challenge and broaden the very meaning of liberation, the very meaning of third world liberation, in ways that were contested, right, and often deemed impermissible within anti-colonial organizations themselves. So, you could ask rightfully or legitimately, why make such a big deal about one pamphlet, right? It's sitting in an archive. Nobody even remembers it in any of the interviews that I conducted initially. Although when I went back and asked people about it, they did remember. And so I did a whole additional round of interviews with some of the authors of this pamphlet that went into the chapter. But you could say, why make such a big deal about one pamphlet? This pamphlet, it was circulated widely among ISA members in the US in the late 60s and early 70s. I've been able to date it, the writing and publication around 1967, which is right around the time that big debates were erupting within Students for a Democratic Society, the major kind of American anti-war leftist formation among students at the time. At the same time as those debates were erupting and resolutions were being passed condemning male chauvinism among the American movement, this is the same time that Iranians are writing this pamphlet. And this pamphlet did not lead to the clear articulation of feminist forms of struggle against the US-Shah alliance, right? Clearly it did not. In fact, feminism as a word was never used. The term itself was tainted by association with the West and co-opted by the state forms of feminism promoted under the Shah. So I can say more about this in the Q&A, but Iranian women, like many third world women, were really caught between a rock and a hard place, right? It was very, very difficult to hold a kind of discursive or political or even imaginative space where you could you could claim a kind of gender politics that was not going to be tainted and discredited by some sort of association with the West or the imperial influence in Iran. And, you know, like so many other women in anti-colonial movements, the whole notion, you know, people face this retort. If you tried to talk about feminism, people would say, well, that's separatism, right? Feminism was literally equated with separatism in people's minds and with being anti-men. But Iranian women were just as invested in a united revolutionary movement to overthrow the Shah, you know, and for national sovereignty, as were Iranian men. So if this was feminism, if it was separatist and anti-men, it was not at all appealing, right? So not unlike African-American women activists, Palestinian activists, Vietnamese women involved in the liberation movement there, and many, many others, Iranian women understood that they shared oppressions in common with men, in this case, the combined repressive apparatus of dictatorship and empire, right? And they did not want to separate women's issues from that larger struggle. My argument is that the pamphlet, University Women Are Getting Organized, documents kind of emergent efforts to push beyond this impasse and to make women's liberation a central concern for everyone who wanted to bring freedom to Iran. I engage this fraught and marginalized history with what I call a methodology of possibility, which I define as a reading practice attentive to those revolutionary roads not taken, to the potential power latent within revolutionary ideas and practices that might have resulted in other or alternative futures and that might contribute to a transnational feminist approach to Iranian women's oppression today. Inspired by queer and feminist reappraisals of the high points of third world solidarity in the 1960s and 70s, a methodology of possibility describes a way of opening up an exploration of the complex lived experience of revolutionary movements, including the Iranian revolutionary movement, that works against the political foreclosure implied by the notion of leftist failure, right? That sort of hangs over, that's supposed to sort of close the door on that history, right? That the leftist failure to bring about more just societies, right? In case after case. More than just a history from below or a move against what Walter Benjamin called historicism, a methodology of possibility avows its present social justice concerns and traces new genealogies of resistance that respond to our current moment. And this is really my starting point as a scholar of diaspora, you know, is how might we identify genealogies of transformative possibility that can help us think and imagine our way out of the current political impasse, right, of the US-Iran conflict, and all of the kind of Orientalist gender binaries, nationalist binaries that structure that conflict, right? I return to the Iranian revolutionary student movement in diaspora because it offers examples of how, from within the space of the US, we can, it is possible, right? People did it. They actually analyzed multiple sources of oppression facing people in Iran, and also linked the unfinished freedom struggles in the US to those in Iran, right? Rather than seeing them as counterposed. So by way of illustrating this methodology of possibility and making clear the concerns that drive my historical research into the gender politics of global third world solidarity and the Iranian student diaspora, I'm just gonna read the opening to the essay that I contributed. Okay. One second. In New York City in the summer of 2009, when diasporic activism in support of the democratic uprising in Iran was in full swing, an ad hoc network of Iranian American women and one Iranian immigrant woman decided to form the Raha Iranian Feminist Collective. Iranians all over the world were galvanized by the mass demonstrations in Iran, which became known as the Green Movement. These demonstrations, the largest since the revolution in 1978-79, began as a rejection of a fraudulent presidential election, and then expanded to encompass broader demands against dictatorship. Rather than simply repeating the slogans from the streets of Tehran on the streets of New York City, the women who came together to launch Raha were committed to a transnational feminist practice attentive to multiple sources of oppression and multiple sites of struggle, Iran, the US, and the Iranian diaspora itself at the same time, right? We were trying to think about how what we did would resonate in all of these locations at the same time. And this approach required thinking critically about what it meant to condemn dictatorship in Iran while standing in the heart of US empire. Raha members were intent on expressing solidarity with the millions of Iranians who were protesting the actions of their own government, but we were also concerned that a singular focus on the lack of democracy and human rights in Iran would dovetail with a right-wing US agenda of sanctions and war. Feminists in Iran, as well as Raha members in New York, were also concerned that issues of gender and sexual inequality would be marginalized by the mainstream of the Green Movement, or worse, used as a pretext for US intervention, as was the case in Afghanistan and Iraq. With signs decrying human rights abuses by both the US and Iranian governments and a banner that read, "Liberation comes from below," Raha members, including myself, joined the rallies outside the United Nations and elsewhere in an effort to oppose imperialism and dictatorship and to uplift a transnational feminist vision of the meaning of solidarity. Although we were self-conscious of our location outside Iran, we were also engaged with Iranian feminist legacies emanating from the Iranian revolutionary movement, at that time 30 years earlier. The women's uprising in Tehran in March 1979 was our inheritance, our object lesson, and our inspiration. In the midst of the transition to a post-Shah era, those Iranian women who came before us had fought to secure equal citizenship and basic democratic rights as primary and not secondary issues on the revolutionary agenda. They had, if briefly, launched a mass movement that opposed imperialism and gender oppression at the same time and challenged the notion that women's rights represented a foreign threat to national unity. We needed to learn their story and find within it an orientation that could help us make sense of our current predicament, in which Iranian diasporic denunciations of the lack of democracy and women's and human rights in Iran could easily fan the flames of Islamophobia and bolster threats of war. So we organized at that time a public screening of the French documentary about the March 1979 women's uprising in Tehran called Liberation Movement of Iranian Women, Year Zero. And we did that on International Women's Day in 2010 for a packed audience in downtown Manhattan. And Golnar was there too. That night, and part of organizing it too. That night, it became clear that we were not only claiming this event as part of a genealogy of transnational feminism, but we were also recuperating an all but lost history of Iranian women's revolutionary activity, passing it on to a new generation of feminist and queer diasporic activists, Iranian and otherwise. This diasporic perspective and the ongoing need for an anti-imperialist politics of gender and sexual liberation informs my exploration of Iranian women's organizing in the US in the years before the revolution. And so to conclude, you know, we were doing that work, right? We were tracing a genealogy, right, of feminist anti-imperialism back through the moment of revolution and its immediate aftermath, where suddenly everything is up for grabs. What is the new society going to be? What are going to be the new gender roles and laws and policies? You know, what new forms of social relations will exist? And it's in that moment that tens of thousands of women who were part of making the revolution fled into the streets of Tehran and put demands for their own liberation at the center, right? I can talk about what happened then, but for me, it was really remarkable to come across this pamphlet from 1967, so many years earlier, right? Written in Northern California, in which some efforts towards these same ideas could be discerned, you know, in which you could see an effort to have they didn't use the word feminist, but a gender politics of national liberation, right? And where you could also see an effort to depart from the standard hierarchical script of the left, in which national liberation came first, and then other forms of oppression were secondary, right? And an effort to say that actually women's liberation, gender equality, the fight against male chauvinism, as they put it, had to be right at the center of the anti-Shah movement, you know, right at that time. So I'll stop talking there. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Manija, as well as Golnar, for great presentations. Let me just, before I hand it over to Bita for her comments and questions, let me just flag that we have another wonderful essay in the volume, actually dwells on and thinks through this now famous documentary that Manija mentioned. So Nigar Motadeh, both in her already published book Whisper Tapes, discusses the feminists who were in Iran in March 1979. But in an essay for our book, she discusses the different debates among feminists who traveled from Europe, from the US to Iran in 1979, and engages with some of those issues. But without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Bita, who's going to share some thoughts and questions, and she'll get the discussion rolling. And we have your questions slowly coming in the chat that we'll also tackle afterwards.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you to Sahar for organizing, and thank you to Professors Keshavarzian and Mirsapasi for inviting me to participate in this event. It's really been a privilege to get a sense of how older and newer generations of Iran scholars are working together. So these two chapters that I've been asked to comment on are, I'd like to say, both incredibly rich, right? And so I tried to zoom out from some of the many fascinating granular details and close readings that they each offer to find questions and connections that would allow us to maybe have more of a conversation, right? And it seems like there's plenty of questions coming into the chat that will allow us maybe to then kind of zoom back in to look at some of those more minute details of each of your analyses. But so for the time being, I'd like to ask three kind of categories of questions, right? I have a methodological question, a sort of conceptual question, and then finally a kind of ethical or political one. And the methodological question, right, has to do with this whole idea of globalizing 1979, right? And I would be curious to have both Manija and Gulnar just describe us how they would describe their method, the method they use of arriving at some of the global or transnational dimension of their accounts. And I ask because on the one hand, you know, the series of events that we're all participating in and the edited volume to which you have both contributed are organized around the goal of exploring new ways of situating Iran and the history of the revolution in a kind of wider web of people, places, and ideas, right? Just basically getting beyond the kind of confines that have for long sort of set the terms of debate. But I'm also interested in asking this question because as I read your two chapters, it seems your approach to this question is distinct, right? It was interesting to hear Manija kind of invoke the idea of, like, you know, creating a genealogy, because for me that I associated that term more with the way Gulnar approached, you know, this idea of prisons and prison building. You know, for me, the idea she mentioned in her presentation of moving away from a movement-centered analysis towards a more genealogical one kind of captured for me some of what you were doing, right? Which is tracing the emergence of a carceral imagination as manifested not just in institution building, but state action, reformist critique, and looking at the Iranian instantiation of a global phenomenon of mass incarceration, right? And it's by looking at all of these things together that it seemed to me you, Gulnar, were able to reveal how London, Sweden, Tbilisi, and Illinois all converge on Iranian prisons, right? But for me, again, trying to think of how your guys' approach to this question of how do we globalize 1979 and the years leading up to it, right? It seemed what your way of getting at that problem was to focalize this concept of diaspora, right? And of these transnationally mobile actors. And it was by, again, centering these sort of concepts that you were able to explain how Iranian Marxist or activists whose Marxist and anti-imperialist frames of reference both influenced and were influenced by American student activist concerns and other sort of local dynamics, arrived at a unique gender consciousness and politics of their own. So this is, of course, just my impression. That, you know, again, one of your approaches more, we could say, object-oriented and the other more subject-oriented. But I'd like to hear on the sort of methodological level how you, by your own account, would explain the terms and ideas that were operative to you in your endeavor, again, to globalize 1979. And I thought it would be interesting, again, on this sort of methodological level, to have you guys think, how might your project differ if you had applied the method of your co-panelists to your ultimate area of study, right? Just as a little experiment. So that's my methodological question. And then I have a conceptual question that is, of course, interrelated to the first. And that is, I'd be interested to hear if you guys have sat to consider some of the risks, if any, and rewards you associate with the analytical moves and categories you invoke to, again, transnationalize or globalize the history of Iran. And the things I'm in particular thinking of are, you know, for instance, Gulnar, you mentioned at one point that, and as you did it again during the talk, that the story you tell of mass incarceration and criminalization and of the creation of this carceral consensus in Iran is not just an Iranian story, right? It's a global story, and that's really significant to your argument. But I was wondering, you know, what are the benefits of situating Iran in this sort of global gamut, and what are the risks, again, if any, of arguing that prisons are not governed, or prison practices are not governed by distinct types of governing, right? Like liberal versus Islamic. And, you know, do you wonder if this argument of yours, again, that this is of course a story that has Iranian peculiarities, but it's ultimately a global one, risks losing some of the specificity that I think we ultimately, as, you know, historians of Iran are also keen to capture, right? And thinking again of what I mean with this question in your account manager, for me was, you know, the fact that on the one hand you want to hold on to certain specificities, right? You say that the story of women's activism and of student activism in the US is both local, it's both diasporic and transnational, right? And you're also careful, again, in your attempt to hold on to certain specificities, to say that because the history of human rights and feminism has been used in such fraught ways to malign Iran and Islam, that we need to not establish a hierarchy between feminism and anti-imperialism, right? Between American and Iranian activists, as one being more influential than the other. But, you know, in the end, you do sort of embrace this term feminism, right, to describe the sort of nascent gender politics and consciousness of the ISA. And I think, again, this is of course not coincidental or arbitrary. It's very important to your argument and to this move you want to make to kind of connect these past instances of activism to present ones, right? And to connect these concerns with anti-imperialism to ones associated with anti-chauvinism, male chauvinism, right? But while, again, the term feminism allows you to establish these sort of transnational and transtemporal interlinkages, I wonder, you know, again, in our quest to transnationalize and globalize these things, if you think there is any possible hazard to you know, embracing a term that, as you again mentioned, was viewed with some degree of skepticism by contemporary actors. So that's my second sort of actual question. And a final point to that, I would add, thinking again about both the risks and rewards of again, a transnational or global reading of these movements. I'm curious to hear if you think that these Iranian kind of instances of these various things you're studying have something bigger to tell us about, say, prisons or about diasporic activism, right? Is there a way to have Iran kind of talk back to these larger kind of categories of study that animate your interests? And again, I have just one final sort of ethical political question, which is also kind of tied into that second question, right? And it's also tied into this methodology of possibility that Manija describes. And although Manija is the one to kind of explicitly conjure this methodology, it seems to me that both you and Golnar are writing and thinking from a place of what if, right? Like, what if Iranian revolutionaries had questioned this carceral consensus, had questioned this sort of binary between political and non-political prisoners, and what if these ISA women activists had sat a little longer with the implications of their arguments for this sort of para-economic and cross-class oppression of women, right? And so, while I think it's interesting that you guys are, I think as we all sort of do, kind of thinking and writing from this place of like intellectual political curiosity, I'm also interested to know how you guys square the idea, how you square this kind of commitment to connecting the past, right, to present day political concerns with I think this commitment we might all share of non-normative judgment, right, of not holding past actors to present standards, right, which seems not only unfair but kind of impossible. So those are my three questions, and of course they overlap and bleed into each other. So I'm sure an answer to any one of them might elucidate some of your thinking on others, but that's how I thought we could maybe just create a sort of conversation that would allow you guys to think and speak sort of broadly about the ideas behind your projects, and maybe speak to each other as well. And I can repeat any of that if you guys would like, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, I think that's a great segue into having you guys think through some of the questions and respond to Peter, but also maybe talk to each other. And to begin the conversation, we'll have time for questions from the floor as well. Golnar, would you like to start?
Sure, I can go in either direction. Well, that is several really big and important questions, Peter. So I don't think, if I wanted to answer them all, I would probably take up all of our time and then some, because they're extremely both sort of methodologically and I think ethically rich questions that we have to think about. And in some sense, I don't have perfect answers for at this stage, but I do want to address a couple of the things that you raised. And I think that they might help elucidate a couple of the questions I got in the chat as well. Thank you everybody for your extremely interesting questions. I want to answer the question about, I want to address the question that you asked about losing the specificity of the local in perhaps a broader view. This is something that Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi brought up in her talk for this same series 2 weeks ago, and in their chapter, and she makes a case for, even if we're trying to, I think all of us are invested in dismantling nationalist historiographies. Maybe not, I don't know if all of us are, at least I am. I'll speak for myself. I'm not so interested in nationalist historiographies. I think they impose all kinds of problematic telos on the way that we view the world. But, I do think it's an open question. Is the global the best way to go? Naghmeh makes the case that really sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of local specificity actually is perhaps methodologically something that we should be attentive to as well. And you say, is there a danger in this method? And I would say, honestly, at the risk of being glib, there's a danger in everything. I mean, there's a danger in any kind of methodological approach. There's no methodology that gives us a sort of an omniscient, a God's eye view on the things that we're interested in. But what the transnational does, or the global does, is it evokes different connections, and it produces a new set of questions. Whereas, looking at things in regional context and in looking at things from a city perspective, like I could have said, I just want to look at prisons in one place or one prison or a hyper local kind of history. Yeah, you're going to get different sets of questions that rise out of each one of those things. And of course, and as Ali and Arang would be the first to tell us, we're by no means inventing this either broadly or in the Iranian studies context. Stephanie Cronin has written a great deal on the sort of global history as a method and as a project for those of us interested in Iran. But this is, I mean, Ali himself, Arang, these are people, we've been doing like global connections and global histories for a long time in Iranian studies, but this is a way of trying to get at certain types of questions we maybe are, this group of scholars is interested in. And for me, the prison itself, I think that in the Iranian case, one of the things that really drew me to this, to writing the chapter that I did is the provocation, the part of the provocation from Ali and Arang to say, what are the things that we think we can, what are the things we think in some sense are missing from the way that we tell certain stories? And I think, there's been a lot of writing on Iranian prisons and prisoners. Some people asked really good questions in the comments about, exile of prisoners, about specific political prisons, about specific acts of torture against political prisons. There has been a lot of really good research on political prisons and political prisoners in Iran. I think there should be a lot more, and I do it too. Like, I'm also interested in that topic very, very much. So in other contexts, I write a lot about political prisoners. But one of the things that I wanted to do was just try to think about the prison as an institution that simply couldn't have existed in Iran without this global context. It just couldn't have. That doesn't mean that it's local. It doesn't mean that we actually understand it better from the global frame. I think in some senses we understand it probably, I'm very interested in that nitty gritty detail. I'm interested in the specifics. One person asks a question in the chat about the acts of the strange sort of, in a sense, mistranslations or weird bedfellow, political or intellectual things that are happening, where you have on the one hand the penitentiary model, which comes out of like Quaker movements in the US, then grafting onto this police chief talking about the dialectical method, and then talking about like the context in Iran. Like, you're having all sorts of very particular things that you need to get into the particularities from. And I think I'll just give one example and then turn it over to Manija. The person that I mentioned, Mohsen Mobassar, is actually really interesting in this regard, right? So I talk about all of these global connections, the global criminology, that he's using this like language of dialectics. Those are global connections, right? But Mobassar himself, we have to know something about Iranian history to understand why he's an important person, and why him talking about dialectics is actually very interesting from the point of view of those of us interested specifically in Iranian politics. Now, he, like most people in Iranian law enforcement, he goes between and betwixt civilian and military law enforcement. He's initially, he's a career military man, and he's probably most famous. This is not in the chapter, but he's probably most famous for being an intelligence officer in the pre-Savak intelligence organization linked to the military Rukn Dovom, the Second Bureau. And he's tasked in the Second Bureau specifically with learning about communism. So he talks a great deal in his own writing and in later memoirs about, reading Taghi Arani, reading all of the Tudeh party theorists, and learning and understanding dialectical materialism so that he can like explain it to the people trying to crush the Tudeh party. And he has a big part in crushing the Tudeh in the 1950s. And then later he goes on to being this person talking about law enforcement and humane prisons and doing things, and all he talks about in these talks is how important it is that we use the dialectical method to like bring ourselves to better humanity so that we can better treat our prisoners and join the so this is a really weird set of facts. Like, how do we hold those tensions in our mind? And I think that for me, methodologically, it means toggling between as a historian, the sort of specifics, the irreducible specifics of the Iranian archive, and then trying to think about that in a broader frame. How do we theorize the global if we're theorizing from the Iranian context? I think a figure like Mobassar is a really good way to do that, to think about what it means that you have this profoundly anti-communist, this anti-communist military figure who's then also part of somehow promoting humanist prisons, who's then also somehow part of suppressing the Tudeh party, who's also going to like international conferences, who's doing all these interesting things. I think that we can get at that sometimes, that set of questions, by actually toggling between these things methodologically and conceptually, and reminding ourselves that, yeah, as I said, like every methodology brings with it its own set of problems. I do want to say one last thing though, also in response to that, is that part of it is the answer to this question would be different with a different scholar, because what I've come to realize, what I share with Manija, and this is an answer to what would you do if you were using Manija's methodology, although we do really different work, we use different methodologies, we use different kinds of reading practices, I think there's one thing that I do think we actually share, and it's that we're diasporic scholars, in the sense that Stuart Hall talks about. We are looking at questions diasporically, and that is why the way that I think about things has to do with my own position, my own relationship to Iran, to its diaspora, to its history of prisons, to its history of political movements. And rather than kind of trying to hide those things, which I did earlier in my career, I've come to realize that's just how I come to questions. I come to questions looking at them from, all of those different locations that you mentioned, from Illinois to Tbilisi to Tehran to whatever, those are the ways that my own life and trajectory and intellectual trajectory has also taken a million twists and turns across several continents. And at this point, that's just how I do things. I wouldn't know how to do it another way. But I actually think I share this with Manija, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Golnar. So Bita, thank you for these wonderful questions. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of the issues that you raised, but I want to start where Golnar left off, because I think that, this is an important part of feminist knowledge production and of diasporic feminism, is that we do very explicitly theorize from our own positionality, right? And the kinds of questions that we ask are informed by that very explicitly. So, in my lifetime, right, it's, being able to talk about a kind of Iranian diasporic feminism it's a very, this is not something that was readily available to me growing up here, right? And even today, when it comes to issues of women's rights in Iran, in the diaspora, things are extremely polarized, right? So that we have these kind of rigidly policed positions, essentially folks having to decide which source of oppression they think is sort of primary or most important. Is it the Islamic Republic or is it US imperialism, right? And you have to kind of pick a side, and it's one or the other. And there's very little space to try to have a critique, not just a critique of both, but actually to think about how gender and sexual oppression actually function in both societies in ways that like are interrelated, that there's a long history of US-Iran allyship, that, that these aren't like two counterposed polar opposite spaces where Iran is one giant prison and the US is a space of freedom, right? So if that's a kind of dominant discourse among the diaspora that I'm trying to challenge, then you kind of understand maybe why it matters so much that there were thousands of Iranian student activists in the United States, right, in the 60s and 70s, who didn't see the world that way, right, who were critical of the dictatorship in Iran and of US empire. Of course, they were aligned then, so you could say it was easier to be critical of both. But despite that, I think that there are important things that they did that we can learn from. Like, for example, being able to act in solidarity with many other oppressed peoples who were active in the United States, right? Not seeing the Iranian struggle in isolation, not separating it out, which I think often happens in diasporic politics today, right? Or having an analysis of women's oppression that was not all about Islam or Iranian culture, right? Or something like that, but actually tried to think about how economic and social systems and patriarchy are interdependent systems, but not reducible, not the same. And that US imperialism uses different forms of gender and sexual oppression, just as, other state building practices and ideologies do, right? And so I think rather than say that the pamphlet and the people who wrote it were feminist, which I don't do, I'm claiming the term feminist, right? I'm saying that I am looking back at this history as a diasporic feminist invested in challenging the nationalism of the diaspora, of the Iranian state, and the gender politics of US imperialism. I'm trying to figure out how do we intervene in all three of these spaces. And I think the pamphlet actually provides some instructive gestures in that direction, right? So it's not so much like, what if they could have gotten it right, or why didn't they do it? As you said, the sort of position of non-normative judgment means you take into account the conditions at the time, right? And the ways in which feminism was demonized and discredited, right? Because of the way that the Shah had co-opted it, and the ways that women who raised those issues were vulnerable to charges of disunity, right? Of creating divisions within the unity that was needed for national liberation. And my point is to say that this was not unique to the Iranian context. It's not because of Islam or because the Iranian left was just more dogmatic and sexist than every other left. No, in fact, these debates were playing out across the entire third worldist left, right? You can see it among the young people who were drawn into Students for a Democratic Society, who were trying to be in solidarity with the Vietnamese Liberation Front, right? These same issues are coming up. Why? Because women were being incorporated, were integrated, were joining mass movements, right? Against imperialism and racism around the world. And when you have that happen, there's tremendous then tension and contestation about the terms in which women will be incorporated into those movements. What role will they play? Will they be in leadership? But also there becomes a kind of tension around, well, what are we fighting for, right? What do we think of when we say self-determination or freedom or justice? What does that actually mean? And the more women are fully involved and participating in those struggles, the more women want their own liberation, right? Not to be deferred or a kind of assumption that it'll be a byproduct of revolution, but more and more there is a push for it to be an explicit and central part of what it means to transform society. And those are the debates and the tensions that are constitutive of the third world solidarity movements that often get really romanticized and we're very nostalgic about, but we don't, or we can be dismissive of and say, well, look, they all ended up in dictatorships. And I'm trying to not do either of those, right? I'm trying to say, let's actually look at how these tensions and debates played out, in this diasporic context where people had a lot more, they weren't going to be arrested for holding a meeting. You weren't going to be arrested for carrying this pamphlet from one place to another. So people actually had more space, to argue and debate and do these sorts of things. But it also reminds us of a time when it was not axiomatic to assume that the US was a space of freedom, because the US was a space of massive struggle, right, against racism and against the war in Vietnam, and also new forms of feminism emerging from the left within the United States. We know where American women were pointing out, just how deeply entrenched misogyny and patriarchy and sexism were in the society and in their own movements. So it is not a time in which American women are presumed to be more liberated. In fact, it's a time in which third world women in places like Vietnam and Cuba and many places were actually seen as the vanguard. They were the image of the liberated woman, right, that Americans wanted to be like and follow and learn from, right? So it's a really different moment in which it was possible for Iranian men and women, to really be peers, right, with other activists who are trying to go up against a global system of capitalism and empire. And those struggles were producing these debates about women and patriarchy and the rest of it. So it's not so much for me like, well, what if the Iranian women and men in the Women's Committee had known about like the Third World Women's Alliance, right, which emerged from the Black Liberation Movement? Well, they didn't, So it's not so much about like, what if, it's more like, what if we now pay attention to this? Like, what if we today, who want to disrupt these these binaries, US versus Iran, and the gender politics attached to them? What if we today, who want a different kind of diasporic, who want a diasporic feminism that, can intervene in the US, Iran, and the diaspora itself, what if we pay attention to these nascent or emergent gestures? And what if we pay attention to the fact that third world solidarity was possible with the Iranian freedom struggle, and with Americans of different racial backgrounds who saw themselves as unfree in the US and struggling as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Those, I mean, it's testament to the richness of Bita's questions that you guys gave such wonderful, thoughtful, and thought-provoking responses. But so with that in mind, I do want to give, in the spirit of conversation, maybe go back to Bita. Maybe given your responses, maybe she wants to add a few words or add a question before we do. We do have some questions in the chat that we'll turn to, but let me turn the floor over to Bita at this moment.
Thank you. So thank you both for your responses. There are two things that are sticking with me now, right? Which is one, Golnar's comment that the connection between herself and Manija, and now I would add myself, is this idea of us being diasporic scholars, right? That question of positionality as maybe a possible connection in your guys' method was not one I had considered, but it does seem important and apparent now that you make it explicit. But the second thing that is sort of sticking with me now, and which is related to this question of positionality, since again we're all still writing and thinking from within the heart of U.S. empire, as you say, Manija, is sort of I have again about trying to be generous and non-normative in our engagement with Iran and with Iranians past and present, is whether you guys think there is this tendency to because the past is the past, right, and has this sort of history that we can reference in order to kind of contextualize and rationalize these sort of intellectual and kind of political limitations, you might say. I'm wondering if maybe we should be trying to do that more with kind of the present day as well, right? With present day Iranian politics and an activist situated there, because I'm thinking, I'm thinking of this idea, right, that there has now been this cleavage between U.S. imperialism and women's rights and human rights, right? With Islam kind of opposed to these sort of great little sort of privileges that we are granted in the U.S. And I think there is a sort of tendency for scholars in the U.S., because we have this different positionality from people sort of organizing and mobilizing within Iran, to want to emphasize that, well, things aren't so rosy, right? But again, this is more of a present day political question than a sort of a methodological or scholarly one. But I wonder if you guys have thought about in our present day engagements with Iranian activists, with Iranian scholars, whether that same sort of kind of non-normativity should be extended, right? So that, in the spirit of again creating and recuperating these sort of transnational linkages, that we can overcome sort of some of the political and epistemological differences that lead us to these different conclusions about what the legacy of U.S. empire is, how Islam figures into some of these questions that we're asking. So that's a sort of a more minor question about this idea of thinking about what if, both past and present, that I have. But I'll see if there's any responses to that, and maybe we can return to the chat if there are any questions there.
Well, let me open up with Manisha and Golnar. Would you have, do either one of you want to respond, react to Vita at this moment? You're welcome to just sit on it and come back to it. But let me take a look at the chat. There are more some specific questions there. Let me see if Golnar does want to say a word or two about the practice of forcible exile. Someone from the audience had asked, have you looked at forced exile or tabid and modernity? And maybe you have comments there and how that relates to the creation of space, or how maybe that practice was frowned upon with modern carceral state.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. It could be its own chapter, its own book, really. So I'll try to answer it in a relatively, I don't know, limited, straightforward way, which is to say that, yes, I do look at, in my broader research, I've looked at this question, in part because it started to, exile, tabid, is one of the methods of punishment that actually sort of crosses these big transformations in punishment regimes, right? So if I'm saying in the 20th century we're starting to see this new institution of the modern prison, internal exile or even external exile, is one of the methods that is used in the early modern period and in the 20th, 21st centuries as well. But what's interesting is that you start to see the concept of tabid transform a little bit, where you actually get sort of, I don't know how to exactly put it, like a carceral tabid, particularly for political prisoners. There's all of these, the archive shows all of these examples of political prisoners trying to organize within prison, typically in Tehran, where there's other members of their organizations or other people who are sympathetic to their politics, trying to organize things like hunger strikes, so on and so forth, starting in the really in the 1920s is the first 1910s and 20s, you start to see some of those first efforts, and well into the current day. So what particularly the Pahlavi government does is then try to exile those who it thinks of as the organizers of those efforts to prisons in provincial areas that have way worse amenities, that haven't been sort of modernized. So you'll see, this happens throughout the, into the 70s, and even in the 80s, there's some evidence of that. So even the practice of tabid, of exile, gets carceralized to some extent. It gets linked to prisons in a way that it isn't in an earlier period. We still do see exile. I mean, Khomeini is the famous example, right, of people just being sent outside, away, like go away. But in the 20th century, you do start seeing exile being linked to prisons in some way as well, which I find really, really interesting. These kinds of hybrid efforts at using longer standing methods of punishment with the prison, like sort of linking them in new ways.
Great. I'm going to use my power as the moderator to ask Manisha a question, or an opportunity maybe to give the audience a sense of the breadth and the scope of your larger project on Iranian students and revolutionaries in the 1960s and 70s. So this wonderful essay is very much focused in on a specific space. The space happens to be within the United States, the Bay Area, the number of universities and campuses, both elite and more, let's call them community college-oriented campuses that had a large number of Iranian students. I forget the figures, but your essay provides us with some of the numbers. And then, but it's also not just these college campuses. There are these a large array of activist organizations, Black Panthers, and many others who are mobilized. I was just wondering, I know you did most of your research was on California, but I know you also worked on other parts of the U.S. and Howard, and I think maybe in Texas, if I'm not mistaken. So I was just wondering if you could think, so this pamphlet is found in the archives for the Northern California chapters and branches. Could you, do you think there was these sorts of debates about gender politics and gender struggles and male chauvinism were not taking place, say, on the campuses in Washington, D.C. area? Or do you have any thoughts on that, thinking about the U.S. as a diverse society and geographically diverse space? Maybe you could share some of your thoughts about that and related to your research on these other places.
Sure, yes, thank you for that question, Arang. Yeah, so I did research about the Iranian Students Association, and I ended up, because Iranian students were all over the US. They were in major cities, small towns, every region of the country. So I ended up having to sort of concentrate where I was going to focus. And it also had a lot to do with who I found to interview and where they were located. So really three major sites emerged in my research: Northern California, the Washington, DC, Northern Virginia, kind of Maryland area, and the Texas, Oklahoma, which was considered one kind of ISA region. And so what I found was that women's committees did spread. It started in Northern California. But what would happen is in the summers, Iranian students from different smaller branches around the country would go to Northern California to kind of hang out with and learn from the more experienced folks in Northern California. So Northern California became something of a hub, a training center for other Iranian student revolutionaries, right, who would come there and then take what they learned back to their campus branches when the semester would start. So in that way, the women's committees also spread and migrated. And at one point in the later 70s, there was even a position created on the National Secretariat, a sort of, I forget the exact name, but the like a Secretary of Women's Affairs. Was even kind of created. Quotas were put into place by the early 70s, actually, for all the leadership structures locally and nationally had to have, I think, a third of the places had to be for women. So there were ways that, like, structurally, these debates did manifest in some kind of real efforts, you know. And yet, from interviews and talking to people, you know, it's much harder to change people's actual ideas and practices than simply a quota system, right? It doesn't get rid of, you know, the oppression, right, or the social relations. So those kinds of struggles would manifest at a quotidian level, you know, in the everyday. You know, I have one person I talked to who talked about women were fundraising for an International Women's Day event, and then, like, men wanted to take that money and use it for something else, and they had to fight about that, right? Or you know, I have a whole chapter of my book actually that's about how debates about actually sexual objectification of women, the degradation of women under the Shah and through Westernization, you know, how women were reacting and responding to that and trying to kind of claim a sense of equality and dignity through revolutionary subjectivity itself. And so I look at how these debates over the role of women, the kind of proper gendered subjectivity for men and women, how they manifest in the way people dressed, in who you were allowed to date. I mean, it's funny that this topic really has not been, you know, looked at before, because once you start scratching the surface, I mean, gender is not a kind of side issue or tangential or simply about the presence of women, right? It structures the whole way that people imagine what it means to be a revolutionary, right? And also what you are fighting for, what is the revolution and what society you're fighting for. So I try to look at how these conflicts and debates around gender and sexuality really ended up structuring social relations within the organization, as well as its kind of political imagination.
Very good. And I like the way you put it. That's not just a sideshow, but it's actually quite central in the structuring of political debates and struggles, which is oftentimes the way it's been presented. It's well, we'll talk about the Iranian left, but we'll have a chapter on gender on the side where you're actually, once you center it, you actually tell a very different story, which is part of, if I can say, part of the goal of the whole book, in a sense. So all of the different authors are trying to do that from different vantage points. We have a couple more minutes, and Gulnar very politely in the chat wrote some questions for Manija. You know, she's very barred back. So let me play the the terrible role as the man who's going to now speak on behalf of Gulnar. And but I think it's a good question, because it is actually one of the, let's say, threads of the volume as a whole is to think through the paths not taken, the various possibilities that the revolutionary activism of the 1960s and 70s afforded. Yet what Gulnar is pointing out is that, well, with the methodology of possibility, can we also contemplate what she pithily calls the historical impossibilities? And of course, the last few years, thanks to you, thanks to Negar and others, we've kind of focused in on the events of March 1979, the huge women's rallies and so forth. But there were real limits to what these women could do, and the enormous costs that many of them and their allies faced in the weeks and months after March of 1979. So maybe that's an opportunity for you to reflect. I did see, I'm sorry, I'm bad at this, but I saw Beats as a hand. Is your hand related to anything that I just said, or?
It is kind of related. So I don't know if it would, and it's also for managers. So I don't know if it would be useful to kind of group these questions together. But I'm thinking of two things, right? I'm thinking of the fact that one, as Arang mentioned earlier, I've attended Berkeley. I've participated in the ISA there and the Muslim Students Association. And it's really astounding what a thoroughly apolitical space the ISA is now. Like, it is explicitly apolitical, and I think that is kind of a reflection of how just deeply politicized Iran has become, right? And it's totally retreated from that, and it's interesting. It's like some of these conversations, some of these sort of transnational struggles, I feel like have been displaced into the MSA, where like people are trying to create a politics of Muslim belonging that's inclusive of Sunni students and Shia students, and that, advocates for what's going on in Syria, in Palestine, and so on. So that's a sort of interesting turn of events, whereas like these secular, or I'm assuming to be largely secular student activists, their organization has become like not only more deeply secular, but just like so secular that politics aren't even a question anymore. And then now this explicitly kind of religious setting, at least at Berkeley, has become a real hub for thinking about politics in a transnational way. And I'm thinking of how that relates to sort of your attempts to link these organizations and these activists to this kind of transnational feminist possibility, right? And another thing I'm thinking of is I've recently had the privilege of reading a draft of Professor Ali Mirzafazi's autobiography, which I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about, but that's something that people should keep on their horizon. And there's this pretty astounding vignette towards the end of the book where he talks about this University of Tehran professor and like Marxist feminist activist, Homa Nater. And she's of course concerned with women's rights, she wants to say, but she's unconcerned with the fact that Shi'i clerics are playing increasingly an outsized role in the trajectory of the revolution. And she dismisses a group of foreign reporters who question her about this as like being basically out of hand, right? Like, she has no concern whatsoever about the future of women's rights, even in a post-Pahlavi situation in which Islamist activists have a significant degree in kind of moderating politics. And I'm wondering again how, of course you're thinking of your study itself is focused on this sort of one smaller group of activists, right? But your politics, which I think you very explicitly position in the book, is wants to kind of connect these disparate geographies, right? But there's such different kind of like cadences that the discussions about women's rights takes in them. So I'm wondering, and this was sort of related to the last question that I maybe didn't pose so well, like how do you try to square all of these things, right? In your attempts to kind of cohere out of these very disparate kind of locations and and discourses like a transnational feminist politics. Is this related to what Gulnar is asking about, like a potential impossibility?
Thank you so much, both of you, for these questions. Yeah, I think yes, the methodology of possibility is absolutely a response to the historical impossibilities. Absolutely, the two are related. And so the March 1979 events and even the role of Homa Natek are extremely relevant to all of this, right? That, part of what makes it, so in March 1979, I have a chapter about this in my book. I do a close reading of the documentary, and if you read the manifestos and statements, and you look at some of the things that women's organizations were putting out at the time and in the aftermath, right, they're straddling this very fine line, right? They're under a tremendous burden to never appear as if they are separating women's issues from the national struggle, right? So they have to continually say, we are for the working class and the poor, they have to continually, reprise almost a perfunctory and even like defensive preemptory way. They have to like recite all those proper positions, and then they can get to, what's actually very new and interesting, which is putting forward, a kind of politics of women's liberation, in the moment of revolution and its immediate aftermath, which is what they're trying to do. And what happens in the midst of those demonstrations is that, in some ways it's not that different than what Gulnar was talking about, how across the political spectrum from, Islamists on, the right, I guess you could say, all the way to various kinds of Marxists with the liberal nationalists in between, there's a kind of consensus, right? That now is not the time for women to be raising these demands, that it can only be, it can only make the revolution vulnerable to Western infiltration, and that it is, it's sort of irresponsible and damaging, and also that it's really not that big a deal to like wear a headscarf, or like you're making too big of a deal about these things. They're not really that important. What really matters is national sovereignty and these sorts of things. And so there's a tremendous consensus around that, so that somebody like Homa Natek, addresses the crowds in the streets and in the mass sit-in that day, and essentially tells everybody, it's wrong to separate your lands, and really reproduces this discourse that any effort to talk about equality for women is separatist and divisive. So so in that sense, it is a kind of historical impossibility, right? That you could have a revolutionary feminist politics really emerge as a dominant strain in the post-revolutionary context, right? It's not really possible, because these women are really denounced and attacked from all sides. There's also a tremendous physical violence used to drive them off the streets, but they themselves, are struggling. They themselves don't have the time and the space to even fully articulate and develop the ideas, because they themselves are deeply invested in the revolution, right? They want it to succeed. They don't want to be the reason that it is overthrown by another U.S. coup or something. They really share the goals of revolutionary self-determination. They're trying to redefine what they mean, and that is what people cannot hear. It is just, people cannot hear it. It's like an impossible discourse in that moment, right? But I'm saying it no longer need be so. It doesn't have to be left unread in an archive, or in the dustbin of history, or as a kind of foreclosed forever impossibility. We can pick it up now. We, from where we sit today, can pick it up now. We can reinterpret it. We can draw out from it the tools that we need to be able to develop a diasporic feminist politics today, right, that doesn't, have to choose between Westernization and Western imperialism on the one hand, or various forms of nativist nationalism on the other, right? That we can actually forge a different set of politics today under different but also very hostile conditions.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, where we've gone beyond our actual advertised time slot, but that's a testament to the brilliant presentations here. Please join me in thanking all our panelists, Golnar Nikpur, Manager Moradian, Abita Musavi,